behalf of Extinction Rebellion Global Support Participative Democracy to our first live streamed global networking space webinar. We're also very excited to be presenting this programme to you as part of Extinction Rebellion's UK's Regenerative Cultures Reset TV. So XR, or Extinction Rebellion Global PartDem, is the working group, provides a virtual forum for sharing advice, experiences and ideas on all existing and potential forms of participative democracies, including the benchmark standards of citizens' assemblies. It is especially focused on giving a platform to what peoples of the majority world can teach us here in the global north, on the impact that richer nations have on the health of the planet, and on those societies with a significantly smaller carbon footprint. Our global networking space creates a place for moral and practical support, multilingual interactive training, resources, research, and collaborative remote working among national and regional Extinction Rebellion groups across the world, both the global south and the global north. Extinction Rebellion's third demand, the how, to achieve our second demand, that is to halt biodiversity loss and to reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2025, is that we call for our national governments to commission national citizens' assemblies and to be led by the decisions of these national citizens' assemblies on climate and ecological justice. So this space is really important to achieving this aim and supporting one another whilst doing so. If you want to find out more about our work or take part in any way, you can find us on XR dash partdemocracy at protonmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. The coronavirus pandemic has critically exposed the flaws in our present political and economic systems in their failure in protecting all life. Systems that give rise to and sustain injustices between the majority and minority worlds, but also the inequalities rife here in the UK. For example, the experience of lockdown is vastly different from one family as it is for another, mentally, physically, and economically. So today's webinar invites our three special guests to talk about the challenges of making participative democracy work for climate and ecological justice during this pandemic, and how the precautionary principle is an imperative to apply in any emergency. So before I pass over to our panelists, I'd like to give you some definitions of what may well be jargon to viewers. Firstly, participative democracy. This is a definition from one of our panelists, Mel. Participative democracy is about creating opportunities for people to become involved in the decisions that affect their lives, and for people, organizations, and institutions to have the skills to do this effectively. Secondly, a definition on the precautionary principle. Rupert has given me the following definition. Crossing roads is fine, but crossing roads blindfolded isn't. Look before you leap or step. Where there is a potentially serious hazard ahead, you don't have to scientifically prove exactly how hazardous it is before protecting yourself against it. So I shall soon be passing over to each one of our panelists who have some really interesting insights to share, and we'll follow with some questions from you, the audience, on Zoom, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. As you're watching or listening to these fascinating stories, Please jot down relevant questions that spring to mind, and at the end, we will pose some of these to our panelists. Just to add, I shall ask each of our panelists to sum up their presentations with their key message for us before we go to questions. So, without further ado, may I introduce our first special guest, who's going to be Mel. And over to you, Mel. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me. And I didn't realize it was your first one as well. So I feel even more happy to be part of this event. I am Mel. I am lucky enough to work for an organisation whose whole purpose is participatory democracy, an organisation called Democratic Society. And really, our purpose, as you said, in terms of the definition, is really about enabling, supporting, challenging, doing whatever we can to kind of create the opportunities for decision makers and people to work collaboratively around decision making. There's so many things that I could have talked to you about today, but what I want to do is share some of the practical applications of participatory democracy and highlight a few insights and learning that we've got from along the way, so that could be applied going forward. Okay, so if I could do the slides, great, thank you. If you could go to the next slide. So this is just a reminder about what organisation I work from. I particularly focus around the local government world of work, so working with local democracy, connecting local municipalities and cities and places together. We also have a huge amount of work now happening around climate, which is really only occurred over the last year or so. And I remember us talking not that long ago about where was the voice for the planet. And actually, I can tell you that it's starting to come stronger and stronger through some of the areas that we're working. Next slide. Okay, so there's good and there's bad news. There's a lot to be cheerful about in terms of participation. Organisations, people, institutions across the world are understanding it, are talking about it, and are pushing for it. The days where engagement was considered to be do a consultation really are moving far behind us. However, it is in pockets. So there's pockets of good and there are pockets of bad, and I'll share some of those with you in a minute. If I could have the next slide. Even though there are things happening and organizations are existing like ours now, people are taking part, communities are standing up and being more involved, I still have concerns. Like as I said, there's pockets, there's lots of small scale stuff happening, but actually how do we turn that into something that works at scale? How do we provide at least a consistent set of standards around some of this stuff? And actually, ultimately, what difference does it really make? So I think for me, thinking about the outcomes and understanding the impact that this is or isn't achieving, and what those barriers and reasons for those conditions of success and non-success is something that I think still needs to be developed and understood. Next slide. So where could we be? From my experience so far, I think there's real gaps between the I'll use the term people, meaning generically around citizens, communities, residents, etc., and institutions. And even if there are loads of amazing stuff going on at a community level, and also if there's good intention in the institutions, more often or not, they don't connect well. Now, that can be for a number of reasons. That can be to do with power dynamics, lack of trust, things that have gone badly in the past. But building this bridge, this is the gaps that I see, and finding people with the skills, the compassion, the ability to enable those two different parts to meet is the thing that I think is not yet fully formed. I see lots of potential, but it's a tricky thing, because it's a place, a space, a kind of middle ground where all are equal. And at the moment, society is so built on inequality that enabling that equity of voice and collaboration is trickier than you imagine. Next slide. So I haven't got an answer. I'm not saying there is a framework for participation, hence the question mark, but there are some things that we can really dig into and that we can push more on. And that's thinking about things around like purpose and outcome, context and situation, etc. But really to be able to create something that's got more robustness around it, I think we need to start sharing our practice and our learning in a more robust way, taking a kind of action research approach. So if we can share our learning, and if we can find a way that we can build on each other's learnings and kind of take a more, not experimental, but an experimental way that enables us to continuously to probe and build on what works, but also get a deeper understanding of the barriers, I think we can have a stronger impact. And for me, it's about the legacy of participation rather than the process of participation. So the other thing is to take a reflective look at things after they've happened to see what impact and difference they have made. Next slide. So this one is just about getting the basics right. And actually it links to Rupert's definition around crossing the road with a blindfold on. If you don't get the basics right, then whatever happens, you are building on failure. And this slide is from a piece of work that I did with a local council in Kensington and Chelsea post Grenfell fire. So after the Grenfell Tower fire, we were brought in to do a review of their governance and decision making. And actually, so I did it with another organisation. They did the kind of internal structure around decision making. I got out into communities and spoke to people and was listening and trying to get a sense of understanding about what had gone so wrong. And to be honest, when I talk about the basics, they did not have any connection with a certain group of their residents at all. Just complete vacuum, listening, not engaging, just absent. And so when we're talking about participatory democracy, the democracy bit has got to be fit for purpose as well. It's really easy for people to think about opportunities to participate, opportunities to get involved, but if the actual institution itself is so far away from that, then you have really got to do some dynamic and intense work. And I think working with politicians is a really fundamental piece of work that we continue and really need to do. Next slide. This is another example of a piece of work we did. It makes me smile because it was very challenging, but actually really, really effective in terms of culture change around a local authority. So this was a council up north who basically wanted to, so their purpose and objective was they wanted a new relationship with their residents. They didn't want to be paternalistic, and they wanted, and the outcome they wanted was a new social contract put in place for the area that they were responsible for. So they were all, you know, it's like, well, they wanted to do this, they wanted that, they wanted to talk to people about X, Y, and Z. My push for them, because once I really understood their outcome and purpose of what they wanted, which was ultimately about a relationship, was for them to stop talking and to stop controlling the agenda of what participation was about, and was to just get out and just almost be silent, not be in control of the conversation, not be designing what the participation was about. And we did some design work with some community organizations, some residents. We had counsellors in the room and some officers, and they created the tools collectively to go out and do participatory work. One of them was very simple, a listening sofa. I mean, it's not rocket science. I'm not talking about things that are hugely creative and far out there. Sometimes it's just about have a space where people can just sit and talk to each other, you know, the garden bench, the park bench. And the difference in terms of this, the reason why it really makes me smile is because it was so challenging to the leaders of the council, to the chief exec, who he literally at one point had to sit on his hands because he wanted to grab hold of it and say what it should be. And the resident sitting next to him was like making sure that he didn't take control and was there as an equal in the room. And the prototypes of things that they created were not for the council solely to use, they were for anybody to use. So they were for the market stall, the market stalls in the street market to take hold of if they wanted to have deeper insights and connect with their communities or their users. So they've I mean, this was the very first kind of prototypes. They've grown since then, and they're now on their way to designing what they're calling green conversations. They want to take this and start just talking about climate and green and biodiversity with their residents in a different way. Next slide. So this is an example of a piece of work we recently did where we worked, it was for a combined authority who's created their climate strategy, and they wanted to find out what people thought about it. So, you know, traditional type of consultation, and they wanted to get some initial insights before doing something more larger scale, maybe a citizen assembly or other deliberative processes. And we worked with two very small groups. One was with a group of young people from Dudley, and the other was with a group of people who are service users and carers of adult services in Solihull. So they were already a small group that worked with each other. So they knew each other well, but they had very specific access needs, learning needs and requirements. And we created a workshop based on how to not only hear from them, but what they felt other people like them would think. And we used a thing called a persona. So a persona is a tool to understand people's views on a particular thing. And it enables them to own their story and really talk about the barriers and opportunities. And what they were able to do, so the one that's
Puedo poner acá y escuchar esto.
the one that's on a flip chart there is an example of a young person whose persona, and they created a persona called Adam. And Adam worked at JD Sports, a sales assistant, and they imagined what it would be like if there was a change in transport and a reduction in cars, closed roads, and having to use public transport, and what the impact and feelings of that persona would be in that change situation. So it was a really different way of participants sharing their experiences without having to reveal personal things about their own income, their own fears, by creating this kind of persona person that they could reveal the insights on. Next slide. This is an example of a lot of work we do, which is with the organisations. We hold up the mirror, we get in there, we speak to staff on the front line, we speak to councillors, we speak to chief execs, we will speak to residents to really get a sense of where they're strong and where they're weak. And this is an example of an organisation's chart around their effectiveness around climate engagement and general engagement, where we had a range of questions and assessment scores, where we were able to see where we thought they had strengths and where we thought they needed to do deeper work. This is a test that we've been working on, this tool. We're using it with our climate work across Europe and doing diagnostic assessments of a variety of cities who are receiving funding from an organisation called Climate Kick. Next slide. I want to just say, like, you can do as big and structured participatory democracy process that you want, but do not forget the serendipity opportunity to go where people are. You will find amazing things where people are just really up for getting involved, that don't get asked to normally take part, who aren't those people who are actively engaged and already passionate. We dropped in, you know, you go into a library and you look at the events log and things that are going on. There's many places where you can drop in. Turning up a domino and bingo club in Streatham the other day was just we're always learning, and it's always delightful, and you always get such strong, clear insights for sharing and taking back. The online workshop slide picture there is where we had to, post-COVID, translate something that was offline into online, and I won't go into that because I know that some others, Rupert I think is going to talk about some online stuff as well, but I can answer questions if that's useful. Other slide is around courage and belief. So this is an organisation, Council Waltham Forest, who came to me, who wanted to do a citizens assembly on hate crime, and across the world this is not a topic that has been tackled through a deliberative democracy process, and there wasn't an organisation like ours that have done one on this topic either. But together we were like, okay, I'll be honest, I was nervous because you really don't know what you're going to get when you're talking about hate, and what could happen in the room when you bring a bunch of randomly selected individuals together. But I have to say, it's probably the most powerful experience I have ever had, in terms of the power. It just reminded me, do not ever doubt the power of bringing people together to talk about complex and difficult issues, because it was unbelievable. Next slide. So this is kind of a call out to you guys in terms of a moonshot, like where, in terms of your XR3 demands, but actually in terms of moonshotting, in terms of where does democracy fit in this, and where are you aiming, and what is the trajectory to get there? That's kind of like, okay, there's some stuff that can be done, but what's the golden thread of managing to achieve the ultimate objective? So it's a challenge to you guys, really. And then my last couple of slides are just talking about why I think participation matters. So I totally believe that the way to achieve system change is to be driven by active citizens. I don't believe it's been done in any other way, any other time. I really would like to encourage as many people as possible to be those people who build the bridge, and not just build the bridge and be the connector, but enable people to connect with each other. I'm really wanting to see a place where we get decision making, not just it's the decision makers, now it needs to be handed over to the citizens, but actually it's collaborative and joint shared decision making. I want those people in the room together. I want collaborative governance. And I do believe that by doing things like this more and more, we will start to enhance the social capital around democracy. Next slide. And then the other thing why I think participation matters, so this is linking to the climate action that we need. I think that if we don't empower people to fully participate in their own carbon neutral futures, then I think the struggles ahead will be even harder. So it's not just taking people on the journey, it's giving people the power and the tools to effectively enable that themselves. I think there are kind of the managing the opportunity costs, in particular around not, you know, the investment and the politics, but so that there is justice and fairness in terms of those changes and how they are taken forward. And you know, my limited engagement and experience with XR, that is where you have such a different voice compared to some other groups and some other campaign groups. The whole thing around equitable justice, just transitions, I'd say, is something that I think you have a real role to play in that. I think that's my last slide, and I think in a way, I know you asked for a summary. My summary really is the call out and the role that I think XR can play in participatory democracy. I don't quite know how to join these dots together, and I'm hoping that through the conversation today, that'll be something we can work out. So that's it from me. Handing over.
Thank you, Mel. That's wonderful. Thank you for your amazing insights and experience. Let us now go on to Flavia, please.
A very good evening to everyone. My name is Flavia Akello, Global Support Regional Strategic Support and Partnerships. I am calling from Uganda. Tonight, I am talking about traditional beliefs on climate change and how the pandemic has profoundly excavated on the situation of the vulnerable women. I want to say that in most parts of Uganda, especially the rural areas, most people believe in the supernatural evil forces that some people in the communities can cause, and therefore any misfortune that is in life is attributed to those forces. For example, in many places, in those rural areas, whenever there is a poor yield, there is lightning, there is hailstorm, there is long drought. Very many people related to witchcraft. And we have what they call the rainmakers. People believe that every time they need rain or when they don't need rain, actually these people can make it happen their way. So they basically go ahead and cut down trees whenever they need. And that is actually deforestation. They do not know how that affects. You believe that a certain crops are supposed to be grown in certain areas. For example, rice is supposed to be grown in swampy areas. They also believe that sugar cane and then yams have to be grown in these places. We also have trees like the eucalyptus. They believe that these trees are actually supposed to be grown in these places. And so they end up reclaiming the swamps and the wetlands. And so they end up drying. That also affects our climate. But the most amazing is this traditional belief of which is the customary ownership, that people get so attached to where they belong or where they lived or their ancestors. For example, people around the mountainous areas of a place called Bududa. This is around the Mount Elgon. And then now we also have places like Bududa. And many people have ended up losing their lives in these areas because they indulge in these the practice things that affect the mountainous areas. So you find that the landslides, whenever there is a heavy rain, there are landslides and people end up losing their lives, properties, and so many other things. So basically, the human interference with these places have really caused disaster. And people are not sensitized in Africa eh, basically, because this cuts across Africa. People have traditional beliefs, people have cultural beliefs, and this cuts across Africa. It has caused many deaths, imprisonments, and hatred even amongst people, thinking that the others cast spells in their gardens, in their crops. So I believe that there's so many remedies for these situations around. For example, if we sensitize people on this kind of belief, if we explain to them that actually modernization and development is some of the causes of these disasters, and the deforestation actually causes the global warming, that sometimes they actually don't get exactly what they have to get, more especially those people who are doing their plantations, those who expect to do their crops in certain seasons and then they don't get them. They really need this kind of thing. We also know that a lot of mining is going on in Uganda. For example, we have the oil mining that is going on in the Albertine. It's supposed, actually, it was, an agreement was signed between Total and Uganda, that it was supposed to have commenced in March, but they had to push it to September with assumptions that by then COVID would be done, and that is when the mining would go on. This was really caused a lot of degradation in our climate. The reclamation of wetlands around Uganda, we have very many, we have like a wetland in Namamve that the government had actually made this place and is an industrial park. So it is basically taken up by that. And then we also have an area that is also a wetland called Boise. These people have taken up this place for settlement. Very many people have settled there. And so they get so many disasters like floods, and their hygiene is really terrible in such places. So these activities have really caused climate degradation a lot. As we all know that Africa is organized
I think we seem to have had some. She's
basically controlled by traditionalism. If we join hands, people sensitize them and actually work together with them, use the traditions like the kingdoms. We still
I think Flavia, we have some problems, Flavia, with the internet.
have the kingdoms, we have local councils. If we can have sensitized, make it better. Oh, are you hearing me now?
Yes, Flavia, thank you. There was a few interruptions, but I think we caught your sentences. Would you like to continue? Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Miss Nisi. And then coming to COVID-19. According to World Health Organization, it was declared a pandemic, and this has affected us globally. And it has affected so much the vulnerable women. And my concern today is actually the vulnerable women, because I so much deal with women and I love women so much. So I so much have interest in these people. Women, these vulnerable women that we have down in Africa, maybe I have to explain to you specifically in Uganda that very many women are the breadwinners in the homes. They are ones who provide much more in the homes. Women have to do all sorts of jobs to provide for their family, because you find that most of them are single women, mothers. You find that they've been in a polygamous marriage where men sometimes do not. You find that a man has 3 wives and maybe he's concentrating on one home. So most of these women do casual jobs, like they are casual laborers. You find that they are security guards. They are vending small things, like you find them vending mangoes. They are hawking bananas, and this is the kind of job they have. But since COVID-19, there is a lockdown, and these women have to social distance, they have to stay home. So basically, they cannot provide for their family. So we went ahead as XR women to look out for these women. And the reason why I went to look out for them, because I know that they actually earn hand-to-mouth jobs.
Flavia? Flavia, that we seem to have lost our connection. It seems we have lost our connection with Flavia at the moment. Hopefully, if we wait a few minutes, we'll be able to return to hearing her. Hello.
Nessie, do you want to check your chat?
Okay.
I'm happy to speak now if that's the best use of our time.
Yes, I think that would be. That will probably. Have you got any message, Christian? Am I on? I think what we'll do. We seem to have lost connection with Flavia, so. At the moment, if it's okay, we go to Rupert, and then as soon as Flavia comes back, we can return to her story.
Or maybe it's better if I do my whole thing and then when I finish, she resumes.
Yes, I think that would be best.
Okay.
Yeah. Lovely. We will be back, hopefully, definitely back with Flavia. Rupert, would you like to please introduce yourself and
Yes,
your
very happy to.
presentation?
So I'm
Thank
Professor
you.
Rupert Read. I'm a national spokesperson for XR in the UK, and I'm in political liaison for Extinction Rebellion. And a lot of my work is on the precautionary principle, which is the reason why we dreamed up this this precise topic for this afternoon's event. I think it's good that I'm going last, but I think it'll also be fine if Flavia carries on after me, because the three different presentations I think are complementary. Mel was telling us basically about what deliberative democracy is, how it works, why it's important. Flavia's seeking, as I understand it, to make some connections with what's needed in relation to the situation on the ground in a place like Africa. And what I'm going to try to do is to make some connections to the situation on the ground anywhere in the world, really, but especially perhaps in places like the UK, although my remarks will be quite globally oriented. So what I want to say, my starting point is that the crises that we face, there's something fundamentally similar about them. The climate and ecological emergency is a crisis that has occurred because over a very long time period indeed, we as a species have been reckless and careless, and we haven't run the world in a genuinely democratic way, which might have made it less likely that we were so reckless and careless. The situation in relation to the coronavirus is that over a somewhat shorter period, although actually still quite a long period if you look at it in the round, again, we've been reckless and careless. And the two crises are in fact directly connected. I mean, the ecological and climate crisis and the corona crisis, they're directly connected because we know with pretty good certainty that the coronavirus crisis originated because of habitat destruction, in this case in China. Habitat destruction which will have been probabilified by the worldwide globalized capitalist system as we know it. Which is a system which encourages countries and localities and companies and individuals to destroy their habitats for profit. We also know that pandemics such as this one are probabilified by climate damage, that as the temperature goes up, we get the likelihood of more and more of these pandemics. That is scientific knowledge. Furthermore, this pandemic has been spread at the enormous rate it's been spread by air travel. When you look back 100 years to the Spanish flu, that moved around the world rather more slowly. It went at the speed of a steamship. This has gone at the speed of a jet plane and has made it far more difficult to deal with. So recklessness has set up the situation whereby the coronavirus pandemic could happen in the first place. It was then reckless and unprecautious not to seek to change that situation. So for example, the kind of thing we should have done is overnight massively clamp down on air travel. The countries which have done that, such as for example New Zealand, have remained almost coronavirus free. What we've seen in this coronavirus crisis is a sort of telescoped version of the thing that we've seen over a much longer time period with the climate and ecological emergency. And as I say, the two are actually directly interrelated. We've seen some governments and some peoples acting relatively precautiously, relatively carefully, and those have been the ones that have come out better in this crisis so far. And we've seen others, such as the US government and the UK government, act extremely recklessly, and those have been the ones that are suffering so far. Now, if we can learn those lessons and apply them to stopping future pandemics, and apply them to other crises, such as the climate and ecological emergency, then we'll be in much stronger shape. So that's why it seems to me that this principle, the precautionary principle of looking before you leap, of not damaging stuff that is essential to us unless you've got a very, very good reason to do so, of not waiting till all the evidence is in to protect ourselves against potential threats, because by the time all the evidence is in, it could be too late. It seems to me that the precautionary principle sets us up extremely well for thinking about these crises together. And it is the kind of principle that therefore obviously informs Extinction Rebellion's ideas, such as our second demand of a very ambitious timescale for reducing habitat damage and climate damage. And it's a principle which should inform the deliberations of any citizens' assembly. So in Extinction Rebellion, of course, we believe in citizens' assemblies. We think that the kind of stuff that Mel was talking about is the way we need to go if, as societies and as the world, we're going to adequately address the kind of crisis, the kind of emergency that we're in. But now the question which might get asked at this point is, okay, the climate and ecological emergency is a relatively slow running emergency. It's absolutely deadly, but it moves at the speed of years, decades, centuries. The coronavirus crisis moves at the speed of months, weeks, days. Have we got time in the context of this crisis to make deliberative assemblies in any way relevant? And my answer to that is yes. And the reason is this. Well, in fact, there are lots of answers to this question. One answer to the question would be actually in terms of the way that the coronavirus crisis should be addressed by deliberative democracy. It should be primarily in terms of how we emerge from this crisis. And that is something which we have a little bit more time to deal with, because this crisis is not going to be over, I'm sorry to have to tell you, in the next few weeks or even months. It's probably going to be with us for years, and certainly its effects are going to be with us for years. So what I want to urge is that at this moment, we need to be bending our minds and bending our attention and bending our movements to pressing the case for deliberative democracy as the way we should decide how to come out of this crisis, how we build back better, how we ensure that there is no going back to the old unsustainable normal. Because let's be very clear about this. This crisis is probably our last chance. It's probably our last chance to adequately address the climate and ecological emergency, probably our last chance even to adapt to the climate damage and ecological damage that is already there and is already baked in for the coming years. So I'm not saying that if we get this right, everything's going to be fine. No, everything is not going to be fine. It's not going to be fine anywhere. It's certainly not going to be fine in Africa, but it's not going to be fine anywhere. What I'm saying is that this is our last chance to come through with some kind of salvageable civilization and to get anywhere near the demands and hopes and aspirations that we have. Another answer to the question of have we got time would be this. People might be worrying, can we do this? Because by the time this crisis is really over, well, then it'll be too late. And in the meantime, we can't have gatherings, we've got to have physical distancing, etc. So let me give a sort of outline practical answer to that question, as Mel trailed earlier. There are ways of doing this. We could have citizens' assemblies with physical distancing, or we could do them online. The French Climate Assembly moved online. The British Climate Assembly moved recently online. It's not beyond the wit of man and woman to do this if it's important, and it is very, very important. Another answer to the question of have we got time is, well, look, if it's really crucial, and it is really crucial, we can, if necessary, telescope these processes. They don't have to take months. You could do them in days, you could do them even in a day. Iceland famously did so some years ago to try to resolve where to go after the financial crisis and its terrible version of that with its banks all collapsing. Or there's this gentleman, the major deliberative democracy theorist, James Fishkin, whose books I would recommend. He famously argued that you could have a deliberative democratic process that took just half a day, which would immeasurably improve, for example, presidential election processes. On the morning of an election, you could have people get together for a few hours and work through the issues, and that would immeasurably improve the outcome. And I think he's almost certainly right. Now, look, I'm not saying that it's credible that you could have an assembly to decide how you come out of the coronavirus crisis in the best possible way that took just a few hours. What I am saying, though, is that there are ways of dramatically telescoping these processes if we are determined to have these processes and if we are clear on the importance and salience of them to the situation that we're in. And I think we should be so clear. So to try to sum up my remarks, we have been extremely reckless, which is why we are in the long climate and ecological emergency. We have been in some respects reckless, which is why we're in the short coronavirus emergency. Some of us have been less reckless than others, and we can and should learn from that. We should seek to be precautious in the long run to get out of these combined crises. In particular, it would be an absolute catastrophe if we jumped from the frying pan of the coronavirus crisis to the fires of climate breakdown. We have to build back better. We have to reset in ways that are compatible with us and our children having a future, and especially in the parts of the world that are the most vulnerable to the climate and ecological emergency. And we can do this. And crucial to the way that we can do it is by insisting upon deliberative democratic processes to enable us to do this. So if I've got one plug and one plea, it is please at the local level, at the national level, at the international, and indeed at the global level, Let us be pressing now for citizens' assemblies to chart the way out of the coronavirus crisis wisely, a way out of that crisis which will be good for people and planet and that will not worsen the underlying and ultimately far more serious climate and ecological emergency. I think we can do this. I think we can press now for a global citizens' assembly. And as I say, at every level, global, national, local, this is something which movements such as Extinction Rebellion can, and I passionately believe, should be pushing for at this moment as our best hope in this scenario, which, as I say, I believe is almost certainly our last chance to salvage human civilization. Those are my remarks. Thank you. Nessie, you're muted. You're still muted.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Rupert. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Rupert. And we have Flavia back, I think. Flavia, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Sorry for the network.
No problem at all. Rupert has presented, and we wondered if we could go back, please, to your slides. We got to your first set of slides. Would that be possible? It was just as you were beginning your slides that we lost contact with you.
Yeah, sure. Sure, we can go on. We can have maybe the first slide.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So out of what we made at home, the soap, we went out to these vulnerable women. We visited these places, giving them out soap. Just a piece is what we could do. And also we gave them masks that we tailored from home. I'm not a professional tailor, but we did something and it really worked for them. And this is the hygiene around these women's places and where they live with their children. So we also sensitized them on COVID-19 because most of them didn't have much idea of what it is. So these are the places we visited. I think that is those are the only slides that we had here. So with this lockdown, I was still saying that so many deaths have been caused in these places. The men have abandoned women. Just about 3 days ago, there was a news around that a man left a woman who gave birth to 3 children, so that triplets, and he practically ran away because he cannot handle it anymore. So you find that there's a lot of hunger, there's a lot of immorality. Like women, since they've always been breadwinners in the home, they have to look for a potential man to take care of the home, like to give the money to sustain the home. So you find that there's so many divorces. Right today, there was a speech by my president, being a Labor Day, and he actually confirmed that 382 cases of violence in the homes, 52 children abandoned in the streets. So basically, this has really been a disaster for these kind of women. So we need to help these women. I can help these women, but with resources, we can really come up with something, and we do something like sensitize them. For now, they cannot do much because of the lockdown, but if we can give them sensitization, we provide them the soap, we provide them a food. You can imagine that at the time we visited these women, some of them even told us that we needed not to bring them soap. We should have given them food. So meaning that they're really, really doing so bad that they even just need a meal for themselves. So if we can come up with this and help them, would really be great. In long term, I believe that these women need something that is self-sustaining. If we train them to tailor their own clothes, if we train them to tailor, for example, diapers for their children, if we train them to to tailor sanitary towels for their own children. We maybe teach them how to make candles, soap making. I don't have much idea, but I've been doing something for them. We could train them on this, and this would be self-sustaining for them. I believe that these women can also do work that people believe that it's for men. We can train them on plumbing, like skills that they can do for themselves. And this could really help them. And also we need to sensitize them on how to keep their environment really clean and their drainages, because you can see in the slides that I put in there, they are really not hygienically okay. So they're really vulnerable because they're prone to even other diseases other than COVID. I may say that COVID has not been so much down here, but other diseases have come up, putting them in too many risks, endangering their lives. So in support, if we supported these women to be self-sustaining, it would really be something great. And I believe that with a participative democracy, we could come up and talk to these local councils, the kings, the traditional people around these people, and sensitize them, identify what really the problem is with other organizations, say for example the NGOs around, and we help these women. That is what I have today really to say for these women, the vulnerable women. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Flavia. I just want to make sure I'm not muted again. That was incredibly humbling to hear your stories, and thank you very much to Rupert and Mel for your insightful presentations. We have already quite a few questions from the floor, so I would like to probably ask each question. Some of the questions are more specifically maybe for Flavia or Mel or Rupert, but please, feel free to all of you to respond. One of the questions we have from Marco on Zoom, it's actually, I could ask Flavia if that's okay. First of all, it's related to inequality and equality of voice. It's talking about how that when there's so much inequality and that people are having to deal with their daily life, their lived experience, they have, for example, as you say, not enough food or sufficient shelter. They don't have the basic infrastructure, soap even. How can they have the physical and mental space to take part or to participate in democratic processes? Flavia, may I ask you first of all?
I would like to say that human beings adapt, and if we bring it to it's only that they are not sensitized. They don't have the knowledge. They don't have they're not they've not been exposed to this kind of discussions. But I am sure that if they were open-minded, and they're open-minded, that if we brought up any change, and if we brought up something that can change their lives, they would adapt to it. Yeah, that is how they really sounded, and that is what they look like, and that is, they really want something to change their lives. So if this is going to change their lives, then I'm sure they're open to it.
Thank you, Flavia. Mel, would you like to come in with your response to that?
Just to say that we, so for something like a citizens' assembly, as an example, we do a lot of pre-work. So we will have individual phone calls with people who have said they would take part. We would do stuff around understanding their own personal needs, access requirements, making sure all of those are met. we've been thinking about how you could take a citizens' assembly online and what the inequalities around the digital world are. And again, it would be things around, so very, in fact, more so, providing the equipment, understanding their skills, doing some practice sessions, doing some training, looking at the wider support needs. So we don't necessarily, you know, when it's something very structured and alien, going, you know, even just going into a room with 40 people that you don't know, that can take a hell of a lot of confidence to be able to do that. So we do put time and effort into preparing. It's not just simply turn up at this day. We've had incredible stories though, personal stories. We had somebody, a really old elderly lady who came to a citizens' assembly, who said it was the first time she'd been out of her home other than for a doctor's meeting in 2 years. We had somebody else recently who had his well-being was not that great, but through encouragement came along and took part in the citizens' assembly. He hadn't worked for a year, his confidence was really low. Through doing it, he came out with a job where he actually got a job as an apprentice with the council. So that, you know, there's real personal transformations that can go, but you do need to give time and understanding and enable as much as you can for everyone to take part.
Thank you, Mel. Rupert, would you like to respond to that, please?
Yeah, well, I'd love to respond to Joe's question. May I do that?
Yes, of course.
So Joe, if anyone can't see the question, Joe asks, Rupert, you say we've been reckless. For 40 years, we knew all this would happen. We've not done anything. But who are we? Are you talking about the people or about the government? And of course, that's a great question. And of course, you know, my talk was quite brief. And if I'd have given a longer talk, I'd have been sure to try to say something about your question, because the answer is really important, although it's slightly complex. In the first instance, I would say the answer is the government. In other words, the governments are those who have the primary responsibility to protect their peoples. In this coronavirus crisis, that seems to be a responsibility which governments such as the South Korean, Taiwanese, and New Zealand government have exercised well, and governments such as the US and UK have exercised poorly. And that's why the Extinction Rebellion first demand to tell the truth, and the other demands as well, really, are primarily addressed to government. But of course, it's too much of a deflection to simply blame the government. We need to understand that governments are to a large extent in hoc to the powers within their societies. So businesses, for example, are often extremely influential upon governments, and they in some cases need to shoulder some of the blame too. And those who have funded those parties which have not taken us to where we need to be, they obviously need to shoulder some of the blame too. But of course, actually, in democracies at least, we all have a bit of a role, we all have a vote. Okay, democracies are incredibly imperfect. That's why we want more participatory democracy. That's why we want more deliberative democracy. That's why Extinction Rebellion's third demand exists. But it would be wrong to pretend that democracies are at the present time completely meaningless. It'd be wrong to pretend, for example, that there's no difference between a democracy and a dictatorship. And so voters too need to shoulder a little bit of the blame. And of course, that then makes the we incredibly wide, and it makes it include pretty much everybody really, although some a lot more than others. Yeah, we're not all equally responsible. So our attitude to this in Extinction Rebellion is really that it's because everyone is at least to some extent responsible, and because we're in this emergency together, although again, some of us are more vulnerable than others, the most beautiful thing to do, the most loving thing to do, and probably the most practical thing to do is to try to drop the game of naming, shaming, and blaming, and actually try to make it real that we actually are all in this together, and to tend to look more forward than back. So in that sense, I would say that the we here needs to be all of us. And of course, again, that is why we want to have participatory and deliberative democracy, so we can make that real. So let's put pressure on those who are most responsible, especially government and financial elites, but let's not play a blame game. Let's recognize that we all bear some responsibility. Any of us who have failed to vote intelligently, or failed to vote, or failed to get involved in nonviolent direct action when we should have done, or as strongly as we should have done, we all bear some responsibility. Rather than blaming each other for the appalling situation that we're in, let's look to how we can work together to get out of it. And that's, I think, really why we're in this discussion here this afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks, Rupert. I have a question from Katia from Zoom. She asks, how can Extinction Rebellion use participatory democracy to unite government divided over climate, ecological issues? And she says, with focus on directly engaging government members, for example, MPs. Mel, would you like to first have a go at responding to that, please?
I can respond in terms of, like, I'm not laughing because it's a funny request. I'm laughing because, like, oh my God, wouldn't that be amazing? But how the hell? I mean, I don't know either. You get, even at a local level, if you get cross parties in a room, they can act really badly. And one of the examples I talked about was Kensington and Chelsea, with the work we did there at Grenfell Towers. They are really bad with each other. They are appalling politicians, and play party politics. Even in that situation, they could not take away their political manifesto and their basic hatred of each other. So I don't know is my honest answer, but I'm absolutely up for doing it. So I'm very happy to kind of pull together some ideas and think through some of that with a group of people. Let's do it. Be bold.
Thank you, Mel. Flavia, are you there? I wanted to ask Flavia if we are still connected. Flavia, in Uganda, how influential could participative democracy be with your government? I'm not
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Flavia.
Yeah, my government, like this, if I refer again to the speech that was given from my president again today, he actually said that, if I may quote him, he said that people should not think that we should be self-sustaining ourselves, or no, we should sustain ourselves on importations. So they believe that we should actually do self-sustaining things. We should start thinking of Uganda producing its own things. We should not look at exportation so much. So we should look at just having something that is just enough for people in the country. And I think participative democracy, this is what it supports much more. If we could just do something that is just for the people, just around, not thinking so big. And it shows that it's welcoming. And so joining hands together, we could make it much more better.
So Flavia, just to clarify, are you saying that probably participative democracy in Uganda is very much grassroots, local, regional, or can it also be in parallel on a national level to influence policy?
I'm sure it can go to a national level. Yeah.
May I jump in on this question as well, Nessie?
Yes, of course, Rupert.
Because as Mel and Flavia in different ways have, I think, just said, it's a terribly important question. I've got a part of an answer to it, I think, which is that the beauty of the Extinction Rebellion third demand and the idea of citizens' assemblies as a way of sorting out these really, really difficult issues, which have been very inadequately treated so far by representative democracy, is, I think, exactly this. So the question was, how can XR use participatory democracy to unite a government divided over climate issues? When politicians are divided over these kinds of things, they're divided partly because the issues are difficult and they are worried that they are going to get voted out if they come up with the wrong answer. They're worried that they're going to be attacked by lobbyists, that they're going to lose money from funders and so on. The beauty of the idea of a citizens' assembly is that if you give it power and legitimacy and authority, it takes that pressure off the politicians and the government. So if you have a parliament or a government which is willing to hand over some power to a citizens' assembly and say, we're very divided over this, we haven't been able to lead adequately over this, we're going to let you, the citizens, lead on it. That could actually work. And I think President Macron has started to understand this in France. I think that's one of the reasons why he brought in his climate assembly, because he realized that the nation was very deeply divided. He'd had the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, attacking him for his attempt to bring in a carbon tax. And he said, all right, look, I'm going to step back a bit and I'm going to let the citizens take a lead on this. And the citizens have come up with incredibly brilliant radical ideas. And Macron can now say, look, well, don't blame me. This is you, the citizens. You've deliberated, you've listened to the experts, and now you've come up with these great ideas. Now, it's not all brilliant. The French Citizens Assembly still doesn't have enough power, still doesn't have as much actual legitimate power as we in XR would like citizens' assemblies to have. At the same time as the Climate Assembly in France is coming up with these brilliant ideas, what's actually going through the French Parliament in terms of bailouts and so on is terrible. So, you know, we're still quite a long way from where we need to be. But the point remains valid that what we're starting to see in France is how citizens' assemblies could be used to deal with exactly the question that Katia has asked us. If politicians are divided, if they're struggling to lead, a citizens' assembly could go much further than them. And that is why it is Extinction Rebellion's third and culminatory demand.
Thank you, Rupert. I want to go to Flavia. There's been a question here from Zoom, and it's from Kevin. Given the fact that Indigenous communities have been using the people's assemblies for generations, has there been outreach to the Indigenous communities to share the consensus on deliberative democracy or participative democracy? And particularly looking at the power of imbalance between the majority and the minority worlds, the global south and global north. Do you think the minority world should reach out further to the global south to teach us something? And how could that be enabled? Flavia, are you there? Rupert, would you like to add anything whilst we're waiting? Maybe Flavia will.
Well, I'll just say one thing while we're waiting for Flavia, which is one of the reasons why Extinction Rebellion is now getting quite serious about the idea of the very sort of visionary, bold idea of a global citizens' assembly is precisely to ensure that voices from the global south get adequately included. So here in the UK, we're calling for a citizens' assembly, right, to chart a way forward for the UK, and we're saying built into our third demand is that citizens' assembly should be required to have a view to issues of climate and ecological justice. So it should be thinking about how these things are affecting the global south and so on. But there's no substitute for people standing up for themselves, right, and for the actual inclusion of those voices. And that's a theme which is coming through quite strongly in the chat right now. So if we have a global citizens' assembly, then you won't be able to avoid listening to those voices, provided it's set up adequately. So that's one reason why I think the call for a global citizens' assembly is sort of game-changing. Let me add just one more thing in specific reference to what I was saying earlier about how we should have citizens' assemblies now to chart the way out of the coronavirus crisis, taking into account climate and ecology. Again, that needs to be done at every level. It needs to be done locally, it needs to be done regionally, obviously it needs to be done nationally, but also needs to be done internationally. And again, ideally, there would be some kind of global forum that was really thinking about that question. And I think that's, again, quite a sort of exciting idea.
Thank you, Rupert. Mel, would you like to respond to that, please?
I don't think I've got anything specifically to add, if I'm honest, on that question. I'm sorry, I've been distracted by reading the chat.
No. I just wondered if you'd like to add anything of your experiences of working with marginalized communities within the UK and how you've been able to enable their voices to be heard, and also how they could be heard online during the lockdown.
So it was, yeah, similar to the sort of discussion going on. In terms of a citizens' assembly, which is a very specific method, as well as the sort of stuff that I was saying earlier, there are ways that you can have people, if they don't want to take part as the whole thing, they can come and share their experience, you know, they're experts by their experience, and just come and do a session where they talk about that. That actually can be quite hard, because imagine having to tell your story or talk about things that are very deep and personal to you with a room of strangers. Again, thinking through how that can best happen, that can be done by video. So for the hate crime citizens assembly, we had people who had experienced hate crime and very disempowered for a variety of things, who did a small vignette story, who did videos that they were then shared and shown on the TV. I think the thing to really think about is, depending on what you're trying to achieve. So my first kind of few slides were about purpose and context, like what's the objective? What do you need? What are you trying to achieve by participation? And unless it needs to be for a very valid reason, bringing a group of people together, get out to where people are. It's the number one thing. Do not expect people to come to where you are, to a council building, to an institution, to a place that feels uncomfortable. Go to where they already are and start there. And it may be that you need to do a lot of pre-work and to build those relationships over time, that they are then willing to come to something a bit more formal. But I think to try and just think that you are going to shoehorn people and their lives into a box and a set of methods and tools that you've created is totally inappropriate.
Thank you, Mel. Flavia, are you still online? I'm not sure if she's still with us. I'm just having a look at the time, and it's actually just after 5:30 UK time. So I think we're going to have to draw to a close. But I would like to have some final words, please, from Rupert and Mel and Flavia, if she's able to come back online, in whether or not you feel that what is the best way forward in terms of participative democracy, looking at post-COVID-19 world, nations, states, communities. Yes, that's a very open question, I realize.
Well, shall I go first?
Thank you, Rupert.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a crucial question. I hope I've already kind of answered it. I'd like to say that I found this afternoon really, really interesting. I really appreciate the people who've been here and on the chat and so on. And thanks to everyone who's been joining us on social media as well. For me, it really comes back to the central plug and plea that I made, which is Mel has told us something about the wide variety of participatory democracy methods that there are, and indeed that's right. And Flavia has given us a bit of a flavor of some of the reasons why this is important on the front line, as it were. I want to suggest that at every level and at every opportunity in the coming days, weeks, and months, that people on this call and people watching and supporters of Extinction Rebellion and of similar movements think seriously and practically about how we can move now or soon to push for or to create deliberative or participatory institutions that will look at the crises we face, and that in particular will try to chart a way out of a legitimate, a good, a just, a viable, a precautious way out of the coronavirus crisis that will also enable us to tackle the climate and ecological emergency. And my number one suggestion is that this should be done by citizens' assemblies. And that if we don't do something like that, then we are going to blow probably our last chance to take meaningful action to stop or at least partially improve or partially arrest the climate and ecological decline that is to some extent bound to happen tragically in the coming years, so reckless has our species been for so long. So that's really my key point. Let's have deliberative democratic institutions. Let's have citizens' assemblies now or soon to address this. There's nothing more important.
Thank you, Rupert, very much. Mel, what would you say?
Absolutely support everything that Rupert just said. I feel it's a strange time, isn't it? In some things, I mean, I can't explain the sort of dread that there is, but then there's also this amazing kind of opportunity of imagining something different that I think we've not really had before. And, you know, the things that fill my heart with hope are stuff that compared to like the financial crisis or even Grenfell Towers and climate change, there's no othering going on. It's not about, no, I'm okay, but it's a problem for somebody else. This is everybody collectively feeling an impact, but also a deeper understanding about us as a whole planet. And things, for example, you know, just in the UK, where initially the government brought in some financial support for some groups, for some individuals, for some specifics, there was a across the nation outcry about thinking about those who are self-employed, for example. And for me, the thing about a citizens' assembly, a deliberative democracy, about bringing people who are different together with a common question that they're working towards, and to do it around how we reset a new normal and not go back to the old new normal, yep, is a real possibility, because people really are thinking about others in ways that they never have done for centuries. So yeah, the time is now. I'm trying to have conversations at a local level with some local authorities at the moment about it. What I'd be really interested is to see how we can perhaps take this to a government level. The thing is the pace. Like there's no time to wait. We need to get into these conversations now.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mel. I just want to check if Flavia is there. I'm just going to. I think we seem to have. Oh, Flavia! Oh, wonderful. May we have your final remark, please, on a way for your concept of a way forward. Flavia, are you able to hear us?
Nisi, I didn't hear that. Sorry, my network has really been so bad. Can you say it again?
Yes, of course. The question really was, our final question was, how do you perceive a way forward post-COVID in terms of participative democracy and the climate and ecological emergency from your perspective?
From my perspective, I actually think that participative democracy can join hands with the people concerned, people who are down with the locals. For example, like I said, we have so much tradition still in Africa with, for example, the kingdoms, the local councils, and even government has a little bit of influence in it. So if we join hands with them, then we could come to a consensus or come together and do something that is just economically self-sustaining, not looking at bigger pictures of everything. So I think that this can work for us. I don't know if this makes sense to you.
No, absolutely. It absolutely makes sense. Thank you, Flavia. I just really want to comment that humanity has been collectively pulled together by this terrible pandemic, and that the pandemic is intrinsically linked to the climate and ecological emergency, without doubt. Yeah. And it is a tangible foretaste of things to come. Even more brutally, if we return to business as usual. And as all three of you have said really clearly, this is our one chance to actually reset. So I'm so grateful to my wonderful panelists. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us. Would you just like to bid farewell, Flavia, Rupert and Mel?
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody. Great
Yes,
stuff. Let's do it.
Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.